Hi, this is Carl, and this is part 3 of the discussion on understanding Michel Thomas. Now, what I'll do first of all is I'll give a brief overview of the aspects which I discussed in parts 1 and 2 of this particular series, and then I'll move on. So I started out by giving a brief summary of the biographical information of the life of Michel Thomas between his birth in 1914 and 1947, the year in which he founded his first Institute for Modern Foreign Language Learning in the United States. Now, I started out by saying that in 1947, Michel Thomas, by that stage, would have already had a sound understanding of what essentially constitutes effective modern foreign language learning, because essentially he was a psychologist and had an appreciation of how relaxation techniques and how a positive frame of mind and a reassurance that there is a way forward as far as language learning is concerned does indeed exist. That also he would have had a linguistic structure from which to work, from which to deliver his courses, and arguably do so effectively. And on the other hand, I also mentioned the fact that around this time, during the 1940s, if we were to ask, for example, members of our third generation, such as our grandparents, how they found modern foreign language learning, then arguably the majority would come back with the argument that it was very tedious, that classrooms full of people would have sat down in front of the teacher, that the teacher would have stood there reciting something for the students or pupils to transcribe, that he or she maybe would have put a verb table up on the board in which appeared the separate verb conjugations, that the pupils would have had to write down these in their books, and then in preparation for a future session, the teacher would have picked on one of the pupils to stand up and recite the information, and if they didn't do so effectively and were underperforming, then this could lead to that particular individual to bring some kind of embarrassment from the teacher in front of his or her classmates. I then talked about the ground rules which are set out in the introduction by Michel Thomas in each of the language courses which have been released by the publishing company Hodder and Stoughton, especially German, French, Spanish and Italian. The first ground rule being the need to relax and not to guess, because obviously if we are relaxed, then we're not thinking about getting things wrong. We're not thinking back to past times when we were in classrooms learning languages and not being able to remember vocabulary, maybe because the content of the courses was completely uninteresting. As far as the repetition of the guessing game is concerned, Michel Thomas discourages almost completely that we do this, because if we guess, then in some way or another what we're doing is we're doubting our own ability to actually recall vocabulary, to translate words accurately. What we need to do is to, when we're learning vocabulary and when we're listening to vocabulary being translated on the CD courses, that we give ourselves some credit for being able to do that, and that we don't underestimate our ability to actually take in the information and actually forget it, because this is not going to happen as long as we're relaxed and as long as we put forward a positive mind frame as far as the learning of vocabulary is concerned. He also makes reference in his ground rules to the fact that memorization and homework tasks are to be equated with the process of modern foreign language learning, because what he sees as modern foreign language learning is something which is naturalized and something which has to imitate the essential and the naturalized way in which we learn our mother tongue as we're growing up as children, in this case in the United Kingdom. So as far as Michel Thomas is concerned, and arguably as far as I'm concerned, if we treat modern foreign language learning as, for example, an exercise where we have to recite vocabulary lists, that we have to try to remember everything, in light of the fact that most people will even today say to themselves, oh, I'll never be able to do a modern foreign language because my memory is absolutely terrible. And you get people saying this who are in their early 20s, late 20s, early 30s, who arguably won't have all that poor memory. It's just a misconception. It's just perhaps some kind of excuse which people put forward from the outset as to why they're unable to learn a modern foreign language effectively. And this is the kind of thing which is said by people who will actually think back to their past experiences in schools and become aware of the fact that the methods which were being used by teachers were in fact very poor, that language learning for them had no purpose at that time, maybe because, as I say, the techniques used by the class tutors were poor, and therefore the students felt as though they were unable to learn effectively, and therefore comes the argument, oh, I have a bad memory. even though in the majority of instances that is not actually true. Similarly, if we treat language learning as a homework task, then we're merely thinking of it as something which is part and parcel of maybe a GCSE or an A-level qualification, something which is a prerequisite to actually gaining a certificate on which says that we're able to perform and speak a language to a certain level. What Michel Thomas is trying to do is to encourage us to learn a modern foreign language and to do it in an efficient manner without learning, for example, set topics, without restricting our ability to only say set phrases. What he is actually doing is, from an initial point of departure, getting us to speak language, getting us to construct sentences of an increasing length, getting us to feel relaxed about our learning of vocabulary, and as long as we have a positive mindset and we imitate the way in which we learn our mother tongue in a naturalized manner, then arguably we can achieve the same goal at becoming linguistically proficient at a certain level in a modern foreign language. And what I did then was to mention in part 2 the fact that when we're growing up as children learning English, we do so in a naturalised manner because we learn to speak and to listen before we learn to read and write. And so this is happening as the initial point of departure. In the Michel Thomas courses, we're learning to speak first, we're learning to listen to a degree, but there is no reading and writing involved because that should come at a later date. What we're doing in the Michel Thomas courses is giving an understanding on a prioritised level of the linguistic structures, and then on a secondary level we're getting an understanding of the grammar, into which are intermingled, for example, mnemonics and memory aids, which arguably can help us to improve our vocabulary. So that is what is happening in the Michel Thomas course. It's simply a different approach to language learning, using a realistic initial point of departure. In other words, gaining an understanding of the spoken language, but at the same time, as I mentioned in part 2, we have two worlds. We have one world in which somebody goes to a foreign language, a foreign country in which the foreign language is spoken as the first language, and are intermingling with native speakers, engaging in dialogue without necessarily attending classes. On the other hand, we have people who are attending night classes, who have not necessarily been to live in a country where the modern foreign language is spoken, who are wishing to speak the language, but at the same time, because they can't really remember how they learnt their mother tongue, are actually in need of some grammatical component. And as I said, Michel Thomas is able, although I'm not really going to discuss it here due to the time restrictions, Michel Thomas is able to prioritise the delivery of pieces of vocabulary and linguistic structures, and then on a secondary plane he is able to inject intermittently and sporadically some grammatical component using simplified explanations. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully I can talk about other things and bring this to a more fruitful discussion at a later date.